To join a live broadcast of Python Live Lessons, tune into my YouTube channel Sebastiaan Mathôt every Tuesday, 10 p.m. New Delhi time, 6 p.m. Central European time, and 9 a.m. Los Angeles time. Hope to see you then, and for now, enjoy this episode. Hi, welcome to episode 3, the fourth episode of Python Live Lessons. Welcome back. My name is Sebastiaan Mathôt. As always, I would like to engage everyone who is watching to ask questions in the chat. This is a live episode, and the main reason to do it live rather than just post videos is, of course, to have a little bit of interaction, even though it's just through the chat. So welcome. What we're going to cover today is working with Git and GitHub. So that's a bit of a different topic than we covered in previous episodes. But nevertheless, we're going to pick up where we left off after the previous 3 episodes. So just to refresh your mind, we have been working for the past 3 episodes on a code project called Markdown Code Exec. What does it do? Doesn't really matter that much for the purpose of this episode. Hi everyone. But basically it is a Python library that takes a piece of markdown code, markdown text. So what is markdown? It's just plain text, and it's often used to document source code. And in a markdown text file, there is quite often some example code, right? Imagine that you have a Readme that explains how you should use a Python library that could be written in Markdown, and there would be sort of some example code in there. And what our project does, Markdown Code Exec, it actually executes that source code in the Markdown file, captures the output that is generated, and then includes the output in the Markdown. Take a look at the previous episodes if you're interested, but basically it's a way of compiling Markdown text files so that the code that is actually shown in the text files is actually executed. So what we've been doing so far is create a code sketch. So the code sketch is the sort of a working, rough, unpolished version of the program. And then we turned the code sketch into a Python package. So the stage where we are right now, is that we have a nice Python package that you can import, and that has, hello everyone, and that has functions that you can execute, and it behaves as a Python package should. But right now I'm being very unsafe by essentially having that package only on my own computer, and it's not backed up, and I'm not using a versioning system to actually keep track of the source code. So right now is a perfect moment to actually create a GitHub repository for this project. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to create a GitHub repository and basically upload the code to GitHub. But let's start with a little bit of Git and GitHub 101, because Git is pretty complex and there's a lot of terminology involved. So it's important to kind of get that terminology straight, and don't expect, if you're unfamiliar with Git, to explain or to understand everything at once. I mean, I've been using Git for years and I still quite often am confused, but I will try to explain it as best as I can. And just to kind of put you at ease, even though Git can be very complicated, in most cases, you only use like a very small subset of Git functionality, and that's quite doable, actually, and already really useful. All right, but I've been very abstract. Let's make it a little bit more concrete with this schematic. And as I said, don't hesitate to ask questions. So Git is a versioning tool. What does it mean? It means that it sort of keeps track of all the changes to your source code. Mostly that's what it does. It basically keeps a backlog of everything that's changed in the code. Where does the code live? Mostly it just lives on your own computer, right? You have some files and you have some folders, and that is where your Python files are. That's your Python project. It's just on your own computer. Then what you will do if you want to work with Git and GitHub, usually, you can also, I'm going to talk about GitHub here as though it is sort of the only way to use Git. It is not, I know that, but just to keep things simple, let's assume that you're going to use GitHub here. Then you create a GitHub repository. And the GitHub repository is kind of like a Google Drive in the sense that it will contain a copy of your source code, or a Dropbox if you will. Now, you're sort of happily coding on your computer and you're continuously changing stuff, right, about the source code. You're editing your files, you're adding new functionality, etc. Now, every time that you've made a meaningful change, in Git terminology, you commit the change. That basically means that you sort of say, okay, I'm going to give this change a name, and I'm going to actually freeze it and make it part of my source code. That is committing in Git language. And that means that at the end of the day, your source code project is no longer just a bunch of files, but it is a bunch of files plus sort of a history of commits that explains sort of and shows how the files changed over time. So that's very useful, sort of a history. Now, then at some point you're ready to actually upload your project to GitHub, to the cloud, and you do that with the so-called git push command. So we've seen two git commands now. Committing is freezing, sort of keeping track of changes on your computer, and pushing is uploading stuff from your own computer upwards to the cloud, to GitHub. That's what it means. So it is kind of the synchronization action, so to say. So in many cases, and also the situation that we're going to discuss today, this is all there is to it. Basically, you're working by yourself on your source code project. It's kind of a solitary activity, and you're just basically committing stuff and pushing it up to the cloud. And that's all there is to it. It's a very simple use case of Git, but already really useful. But now let's imagine that you're actually collaborating with multiple people on the same code project. What does that look like? Then things become really complex really quickly, but I'll explain it to you. And keep in mind that this actually, what I'm showing here, the simple schematic is already what covers most of the workflow in real life. But let's say you're working together with someone else. Then suddenly you have 4 places where the code lives. You have your computer, you have the computer of that other person, you have your GitHub repository, and you have the GitHub repository of that other person. And how do they relate to each other? Well, the first step that other person needs to take is, of course, to create a copy of your GitHub repository, right, to work on. So generally speaking, that person doesn't work directly in your GitHub repository, but rather creates a copy, and the action of creating that copy is called a fork, a git fork. Then that person has a GitHub repository, but needs to download it, of course, to their own computer. And for that, there is the clone action. So git clone basically means download all the stuff from a repository to my own computer. Now, then that person starts making changes and committing stuff, etc. Every time that a commit is that a meaningful change has been made, that person does a git commit, and as such, right, changes accumulate to the source code. Now, once that person is kind of happy, he or she also does a git push action to sort of upload the changes from their own computer to their GitHub repository. And you see how now we have 2 GitHub repositories that are a little bit different, right? You have your GitHub repository that has the original code, and the GitHub repository of that other person that has the original code plus some more commits. Now, how do you then sort of synchronize those things? The first step is that that person sends you a pull request. You see how the schematic starts to become complex now, right? And a pull request is really literally a request. It is sort of telling you, okay, I made some changes to your code. Do you want to take them over from me? And then you can say yes or no to that request. If you say yes, then what you do is you sort of go diagonally like this, and you download, you pull, as it is called, git pull, all the changes from that other person's GitHub repository, and you pull it to your own computer. That is the git pull action. And pulling is actually sort of a composite action of 2 low-level Git actions called fetch and merge. So basically you can say git pull, or you can say git fetch, return, git merge, return. So this is a pretty complex schematic, right? So, but that's kind of how the relationship between repositories is, right? So pushing refers to the action of moving stuff up in the cloud. Pulling refers to downloading stuff from the cloud. And committing refers to keeping track of changes that you make to your code. Those are the basic basic actions to know. So I hope that's clear. If not, don't hesitate to shoot. I'm trying to monitor the chat here. So far, I'm just seeing highs, so I'm hoping that it's clear. So let's take actually a look. Let's first actually take a look at what the source code does, just to kind of remind you. Let's remove this. Before we're going to upload it to Git. So the goal, basically, we have a markdown file, and it is just text, right? And embedded in the markdown file, there are pieces of code like this. Wait, I should actually switch my up like this. Up, there we go. There are sort of pieces of code embedded in here. And what should happen is that those pieces of code should basically be included below, or the output from this code should be included here below. So the source code should be executed, basically. How does that work? Just to remind you how our lovely Markdown code exec module works. This, by the way, what you're seeing now is basically me in a series of episodes making a Python module that I'm actually going to use, right? This is a meaningful Python module, and you're just basically seeing me developing code as I also would normally for other projects. So it works. I can just say from Markdown code exec import parse file. That's how we programmed it. Go back to code exec. Why doesn't it work? Oh wait, I need to change the directory. Sorry, working directory. Parse file, and then I can say parse file demo.md, which is this file that you're seeing here. And then I say okay, demo out.md. So you see it's a very user-friendly module that we're making. And then what it does is basically it compiles, it takes this file up, let's put them side by side, demo out here, up. And you see that here we have this Python capture thing. And then basically below that, we insert the output of those commands. That's what our module does. But that's not really why we're here. Why we're here is because we want to see how we can actually upload this to GitHub. So let's switch to a browser, because GitHub is, after all, a website. Close the slides. So here we have GitHub. And github.com, you can create a free account there. And then you have some kind of dashboard. Here you see I have a lot of stuff on my dashboard. And related to stuff that I do on GitHub. But what I want to do now is basically click here on the plus button, and then I can choose new repository, and I'm going to create a new repository, and that is where on my GitHub account Markdown code exec is going to live. What is the repository name? Markdown_code exec is available, right? You're not allowed to have names that don't exist. A description, executes Python code embedded in Markdown files. Then you can indicate some things. Public, do you want everyone to be able to see your GitHub project, or do you want it to be private? Let's just make it public. You can initialize your repository, then GitHub will already put some stuff in there for you. I won't do that. I don't think that's very useful, but you can do it. And then I just say create repository. It's as easy as that. I'll zoom in a little bit actually. Yeah, maybe even more. Yeah. Now, then actually GitHub already, the repository is empty now, right? We have stuff on my computer, but we haven't yet uploaded it to GitHub. So first, GitHub is giving you some instructions on how to actually connect your code project to a GitHub repository. And it is giving you some steps. It's saying, okay, you should first run the git init command on your own computer to indicate that you want to have a GitHub repository. You want to make some commits, and then you want to add a remote. This sounds very abstract, but I'll explain all the steps to you in more detail. And then you want to push. We've already learned what push is, right? Okay, let me just show you basically how you very easily can upload your stuff to a GitHub repository. And then it will become not so magical. Here I have a terminal, and this is the terminal that I opened in the folder for the Markdown code exec project. And right now, there is no Git repository on my own computer, right? I have to create it. I have to initialize it by saying git space init. Okay. And then it says, it gives you some suggestions, but it also says, okay, I initialized an empty Git repository. So far, so good. Then we need to say, okay, this Git repository that lives on my own computer needs to be connected to the Git repository that lives actually in on GitHub. How do we do that? Well, I just typed here this slash so that I can continue typing on the next line. Otherwise, it's a bit messy. I say git remote. Git remote refers to the stuff that is living somewhere in the cloud. Git remote add. I want to add a new remote. So I want to basically add my GitHub repository as a remote to my own computer. What is the name? Origin. Why origin? Well, by consensus, you call these things origin. That is just, you can do any name, right? You can do it bunny, you can do, your favorite color. But by consensus, people use the name origin for their own GitHub repository. And then here we need to put some kind of address where the origin actually is. Now, what is that address? For that, I switch back to GitHub, and GitHub actually gives me the address here, right? That's it. That's the address of the GitHub repository. So I copy it, I switch back, up, I say, bam, git remote add origin. Now, then what we want to do, now we basically have an empty Git repository and we have connected it to GitHub, but we haven't done much else. And then for the next step, I'm actually going to use a graphical tool called Git GUI because it makes it a little bit more clearer what is happening here. There are, by the way, many different tools to interface with Git. There's the GitHub desktop application, which is pretty fancy. There is Git Kraken. There's just a command line Git. I happen to use quite often Git GUI. I think it's quite nice. But regardless of what software you use to interact with Git, the commands and the logic is always exactly the same. It just is sometimes a little bit shielded from you if you use the desktop GitHub desktop, but the idea is the same. All right, I launch Git GUI. It's a bit small actually for you, right? That's annoying. Didn't really think that through. So what you're seeing here, though, is can I say options and make the font size much bigger? No, I don't. Yeah, okay, I think I can. Yes, all right. Up, okay, save. All right, even bigger, right? Options, okay. I'm happy that I was able to do this on the fly. All right. So this is pretty 80-ish font, right? But at least we can read it. Okay. So what we have here now is an overview of the Git repository. And here in this red box that you're seeing here are the so-called unstaged changes. So those are things that seem to be sort of new or changed and but we're not really doing anything with it. What we want to do then is actually look at it and select those changes that we're interested in. So it is not automatically picking up changes. You have to sort of manually do that. You see also that there are a bunch of things that we're not really interested in. Things like .pyc, that is Python bytecode. And we actually don't really want that to show up there. So what can we do? Let's first actually clear things up a little bit, just so that we're only seeing things in here that we're interested in. And for that, I'm again going to switch back to the text editor this time. I'm opening here, this is the folder in the text editor, the folder that contains the Git repository. And I'm going to create a special file that is called gitignore. And in gitignore, you can indicate the stuff that Git should ignore. star.pyc. That's not really, we don't care about Python bytecode. So everything that has the extension .pyc should be ignored. We also don't really want to have the sketch.py file. We made that, but we're not really interested in it. And we also don't really want to have the git ignore file itself in the Git repository. So that's what we're ignoring. And then if I switch back to Git and I see this and I press rescan, this button here, you see that now suddenly a lot of the stuff has disappeared. Why has it disappeared? Well, because the stuff that actually matches the contents of the git ignore is not shown here. Okay. And now the next thing that we want to do is say, okay, let's click on this and let's click on this. Then we're cherry picking those two files. Here on the right hand side, you see basically what has changed in those files. And for that, actually, let me make the font bigger again, because otherwise you can't see. Up, Gothic. This is a horrible font, actually. Can we do better? Gothic. Well, no, let's just have this 80s font. All right. And then here in the init file, you see basically it's just one line. And here there's a whole bunch of lines and they're all new. Those are the changes. Here in the commit message, I can say, okay, I'm going to have a description here and I'm going to say add markdown code exec package. And then I click on the commit button. And as soon as I do that, I have sort of finalized this change. I've added the commit. That's what it would mean. We also have the demo. I think it also makes sense to actually have the demo file. So I also click on the demo. It also goes to the stage changes. And I say, okay, add demo.md. And I click on commit. I actually don't think we need the demo out. So let me go switch back up and demo out. I also add that to the git ignore, save it, rescan. And now we have a completely empty Git GUI interface. Usually, okay, I see a few questions actually. Now we have a completely empty Git interface, meaning that everything is either nicely in the git ignore or it is actually already committed. And then Morpheus says, usually you do want to commit .git ignore, so the same files are ignored for all developers working working with the repository, and set stencil makes the same point actually. Without uploading the git ignore, others who try and contribute will have their own, or well, it's not the same point, but related, will have to create their own correct git ignore locally. Yeah, so this basically there is a difference, I guess, of taste. Some people indeed add the .git ignore to the project. And then the advantage of that is indeed that everyone automatically gets that git ignore, and also that all developers working on the same project, as Morpheus is saying, have the same .git ignore, etc. And that can be convenient. I personally don't like it so much because in my experience, different developers use different tools and they end up with different kinds of temporary files, etc. And it's nice to give everyone the flexibility, I think, to have their own .git ignore file. But it's not unreasonable actually to commit the git ignore file either. It's a bit a matter of taste, but I never do it in any case. So, all right. Now let's actually switch back to the terminal. Up. Well, up. Let's close git ignore. Switch back to the terminal. And so now we have made some changes to the source code locally. But it's not yet on GitHub. But if I now say git push and I run enter, git push, and I need to specify where actually, origin master. Origin is the remote and master is the branch on the remote. I'm not really touching upon that here. And the message that you get here from GitHub or from Git is that, well, you didn't specify a where you want to push, but you can also set a default by running this command. Right now, I'm not setting a default, I'm just being explicit, and I'm running it here. Up. Git push origin master. And if I now go back to GitHub and I reload the page, you see that suddenly now we have very nicely here the demo.md and a markdown code exec. And Morpheus is making a point that seems kind of important. You can have both a .git ignore in the repository with files that should be ignored everywhere, and a global .git ignore on every developer system where they can add their own file patterns. Is that possible? I genuinely didn't know that actually. Maybe you can explain in the chat how that works and actually Morpheus. Do you give that another name or? So I didn't know that. If that's the case, that would make it more reasonable actually to commit to git ignore. I agree. Okay, so now basically just to switch back to our GitHub repository, it's already looking kind of nice, but it's missing something. Actually, and GitHub is saying that also. It's missing a README, and it's really quite important to have a README. Why? Well, because it specifies the license information for one thing usually, and also it tells you a little bit about the source code. So let's, as a last step, go actually back to our repository here. We're going to say up file, and then I say readme.md. So the readme.md is actually going to be a markdown file, and it's going to document markdown code exec. So I think Morpheus has blown everyone's mind by the concept of having a separate global.gitignore, including mine actually. So markdown code exec, then some description. I say execute Python code executes Python code in markdown files and captures the output. This is kind of a description. I make it italic like this. I say copyright 2022, Sebastiaan Mathôt, that's me. Up. Let's make a subheader, license. You could do this nicer actually. But I'm just going to say for now, because I don't really have the information handy to do this really nicely, I'm just going to say that this is the GNU General Public License 3. Normally you would indicate a sort of a more concrete blurb here and also include a file with the license information in the code repository. I will do that later, but I think for the purpose of illustrating that, it's not so necessary. And I will also say, okay, example usage, and then I will say, okay, I will add some in the markdown file. I will say, okay, to actually use Python markdown code exec, you do from markdown code exec import parse file, and then parse file input.md output.md up.python capture. Alright, in previous episodes we've seen how this basically means that this is Python source code and we want to capture the output. Okay, I saved this readme file, and now I switch back, and Morpheus says the setting for the user's global.gitignore path is core.excludes file, I guess, so you can do it in the git config settings apparently. Alright, cool. Alright, I'm going to start git GUI again. Now we suddenly have one extra file that appears, the readme. Up, I click on the readme. It says new file mode. Why doesn't it actually have any? Rescan. Ah, here it is. Okay, and readme. I commit, and instead of typing git push in the terminal, I can also just click here the push button. Up, push to master. It's the exact same thing as doing git push in the terminal, or doing something equivalent in the git desktop file, etc. Up, I get a nice green box saying that it was successful. I switch to GitHub, and actually if you're watching this live, you can actually see now, if you go to GitHub as Mathôt markdown code exec, here it is, right? Here's the code execute, the GitHub project. All right. So this is a very basic introduction to Git that I've given you right here. There's much more to it, right? Basically, this is just a workflow for you working on your own computer, uploading stuff. But you can also collaborate with other people if there is an interest in that. Maybe in future episodes I will go into more detail when it comes to using Git, but it becomes really complicated really quickly. So I'm not sure there's a lot of interest in that. Other than that, this is all I had to share with you for this episode. For the people who are watching the recording afterwards, this is where the episode ends. So thank you very much for watching episode 3, the 4th episode of Python Live Lessons. For the people who are watching through the chat live, feel free to ask some questions still.